This is Past and Present with Allison Gilbert and James Harris. My name is Andrew Engel, and I am Senior Programmer at Reimagine. Our mission is to help people of all backgrounds face adversity, loss, mortality, and channel the hard parts of life into meaningful action and growth. I would like to thank For Grief. Their renewed support for this series is so appreciated by all of us at Reimagine, and I know by Allison Gilbert. So thank you, For Grief. Here are some Zoom tips. Please note that you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen to get a live transcription. The majority of us are Zooming in from the United States, which is also known as Turtle Island by Native Americans and their allies. I am in Lenapehoking, so is Allison. This is where a large city called New York is located on occupied land. And I ask you to join me in acknowledging Indigenous communities in North America, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. I'm stating this because it's a step to continue the process of dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy. We're interested in knowing where you're located, so please use the chat, tell us where you are, and there's a very helpful map. It's called native-land.ca, and you can check that out, and you can learn about the locations of Indigenous people, past, present, and future, where you are. Please mark your calendars for August 25th for the next Past and Present with Allison. Her guests are Dr. Gloria Horsley and Dr. Heidi Horsley, who are the co-founders of Open to Hope, an international organization committing to providing hope and resources to people. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Allison Gilbert. Allison is the author of numerous books, including the upcoming Listen World, which is the biography of Hearst newspaper columnist Elsie Robinson. And that's going to be published by Basic Books and Hachette in September. Her book, Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive, reveals creative ways to remember family and friends we never want to forget. You can follow Allison on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. She's everywhere as A. Gilbert Writer. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Allison, who will introduce James, an old friend of Reimagine.
Yay, thank you so much, Andy. I am so grateful. And James, if we are here together, it must be the final Thursday of the month, which is my favorite time of the month, because that means I get to join everyone here in community for 1 hour. We get to take a break from our normal work and focus on topics that I feel are meaningful, that I feel are essential. And I am so grateful, James, that I get to start this conversation today with you about men in particular and grief. So thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you for having me again. Like, this is always one of my favorite platforms. You're amazing. You're definitely a good leader, as well as giving people access to information that they probably didn't even know they need. So I definitely appreciate you for viewing me as somebody who can also pass off that information.
So you are the founder of a national organization called Men to Heal. We will get into all of that. We will talk about why you founded it, your background, and also some other initiatives that you have launched since. But I have to address the sneakers behind you. We just got to begin there. Not just why all the sneakers, but I'm sorry to say they look kind of unused, James. They look kind of like museum pieces, like you're not really getting so much exercise in. Tell me about your sneakers before, because everyone's curious. I don't want to have it be a distraction during our conversation.
Oh yeah. So I'm a fan of shoes. But these shoes I actually do wear. They just stay clean. But I
Okay.
don't exercise in them. I do have different running shoes. I do run a lot, so I have specific running shoes for those, like the Asics or either long distance running shoes and things. But these more are stylish and for show.
All right, cool. Well, I'm glad we got that out of the way. And during our Q&A, just in terms of housekeeping, the way, if you haven't joined a past and present conversation yet, and I hope you have, but if you are new, you know that I am very, very finicky about time. You will get out on time. So it is now 1:06 here on the East Coast. We'll be done, wrapped up by 2. At about the half hour mark, I will stop asking James questions and I will turn it over to my friend and my partner, Christina. Raise your hand, Christina.
Hello.
We'll go through the chat. And so put your questions in the chat that you have for either me or James, and we will go through them. And just fair warning, the more broadly applicable your questions are, as opposed to about you and your dog, something about you and your sister, that's very intimate and personal to you, we will go for those questions that are going to help the most people in this time. And during that Q&A, it clearly sounds like you can ask James about exercise sneakers and running sneakers. That is open. That is open, I guess. You're not going to ask me about that. James, I want to start with the stigma. You had talked about there's a stigma for men who are grieving, and in particular, Black men who are grieving. So I want to kind of get right to it. What is the stigma that you're talking about?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different stigmas, to be honest with you. The stigma of equating vulnerability to weakness, not only for African American men, but men in general. I've had the opportunity to speak in different countries, and it's always those targets to men who are vulnerable or are open with their feelings. And something that I often say is feel your feelings, because most of the time, the feelings that men are openly displaying are the ones to where they're stoic or barbaric or just not, just that void. So that's a stigma in itself, the vulnerability piece. And then of course the stigma of the religion, you can say that because a lot of the religious texts have men being in those dominant roles. So, the head of the household, the additional pressures of I'm the man, I have to do this. Those things people don't consciously look at as stigmas, but they are stigmas because those are additional pressures. Then, of course, the societal stigmas, the provider and protector, those things get limited to working all day and physically protecting, like in battle, or opposed to the nurturing and the empathetic one. So, just overall stigma as far as not allowing a man to grieve or be himself without being this shell or carrying a lot of burden and baggage. So it has been a detriment to a lot of different men. They view different ways to cope on the negative side based on those stigmas, thinking that they can't offload certain information. So that's where we are with it.
I want to unpack a bunch of what you've just said and just
Sure.
take it piece by piece.
Okay.
The first piece, when we think about stereotypes, I think in general, we think about labels that are so often put on women. And what you're talking about are the labels or the presumptions of how men need to carry themselves as getting in the way of them properly, or at least giving voice to their pain that comes from grief. So there's a vulnerability about owning up to being authentic. Is that being your true vulnerable self? Is that one of the primary issues that I'm hearing?
Definitely one of the issues, because if you look at it, even if you look at masculinity, femininity, and gender roles, those things have a tendency to separate people into certain classes, not as a reference to human qualities. Because even think about it, if you have a young son or a young male that's growing up and he wants to play house or bake, the presumption is, no, don't do that. That's for girls, but not thinking like he's going to eventually grow up, have a family. He's going to need to know how to do life skills, not specific gender role skills. So those things, of course, blur the lines as well, creating additional stigma and additional pressures. I mean, I've in session, I've had a couple of different men that I've counseled who were dominant in sports or just different things that weren't traditional masculine, like gymnastics. I had this one guy who was awesome at flipping and acrobats and things like that, but he couldn't pursue it because dad wanted him to box and play football. So within our sessions, that's what we did. I allowed him to flip. We talked about different flips, we researched different gymnastics, we different things, and to be honest with you, he had a tryout for the Junior Olympics. He didn't make it based on injury, not sustained from him flipping, but something else. But just the fact that he pushed himself and was willing to give it a try, just imagine if that was nurtured as he was growing up. He could have made it to the real Olympics as a gymnast, but of course, gymnastics and yoga and those things are viewed as feminine exercises and things. So, even some with yoga, I do this function now at my spot, where I do fellas on the mats, and it's introducing men to various exercises, yoga, deep breathing, mindfulness and things, because when you think about being an athlete, most of the times you think about running, jumping, combat sports, not knowing that yoga, deep breathing, and all those things can strengthen your agility, your ability to perform better. So it's just re-educating men opposed to that one-sided mindset of I can't do that because that looks feminine.
Well, let me have you pause right there.
Sure.
Because there's something that you touched on, which I think opens the door to another part of this conversation. You touched on the fact that if there's someone who is able to vocalize an interest, or someone who's able to vocalize to you, someone who gets it, someone who's listening in a different way, that provides a sense of either confidence or validation. And one thing that I think you were just alluding to was your work with Healing Hub. Is that what you were talking about? Because that's where you have designed the ability for people to come together in community. And so I'm wondering, through the prism of men, why is it so important to provide, perhaps, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, not just one-on-one, but groups? Where is there safety in a group setting? So meaning, why did you think that Healing Hub was so important to your work? And it feels like a really good time to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you for allowing me to introduce that. So the Healing Hub, I'm located in Richmond, Virginia, also on the East Coast. And so I'm a therapist, and that's why I do my outpatient therapy. It is comprised also of 8 different offices. So pre-pandemic, I had a psychologist there. I had a couple of nonprofits there as well. Now it's just me being that I let everybody out that lease or whatever. But I also have a venue section. That venue section is where we do yoga, Zumba, mindfulness, healing circles. And I also bring other functions that my community in specific has lacked, whether that's first-time home buying resources, seminars on LGBTQ+, seminars on grief, seminars on trauma, seminar on restoration of rights, just a lot of different seminars are held here because I know the lack of things that I didn't have an opportunity to have as I was growing up. And
James, I'm going to push back on one thing.
Sure.
You could have done that as one-on-one. Everything that you're describing could be offered to people, a la carte, go to a yoga class, go home. But it's very different. You're bringing people together so they feel connected. And so I'm really curious about that piece. When you talk about men and you talk about grieving, you talk about this feeling that they are shying away from owning or at least vocalizing their emotions and their feelings, why provide a community for togetherness? And why is that pivotal for people who are listening to this conversation and they want to bring resources to their communities. Why is group so important?
Yeah, so group is definitely important. Society, as we continue to grow and migrate, Western society, for the most part, has grown to an individualistic mindset. But in the past, it was more of a collective mindset. And with that collective mindset, you get a holistic approach, you get a community approach, you get a cohesive approach. Because like if you think of terms like universality, in which I have in many of my groups, just think of that person who thought that he was the only one that was dealing with some, like the veterans group I run. A lot of us veterans come back, we have hypervigilance, we have issues with, oh man, my family might not recognize that I'm different. I might not recognize that I'm different. But in a group setting, you hear things like, oh man, that happened to me. Or you hear things like, oh, that happened, but this is what I did. Or here's some tips, so that cohesiveness will allow you to be more open and be more vulnerable, opposed to the one-on-one setting where it's just you and I, and we might not comprehend each other. Understanding and developing is something different from that cohesive experience, because when there's 7 to 8 people, or maybe 10 to 15 people, somebody has probably walked your journey, or you're walking somebody else's journey, and it's probably good for you to get that. Not only knowing, you look around the room and you can model certain behavior and take those attributes as traits that you now can use in your toolbox. So that's why the group cohesiveness and collectiveness is definitely important from that individual standpoint. And then, just from a standpoint of how my ancestors grew up, everything was family and collectiveness, whether that was here on this land or in the land far beyond on the continent of Africa. And like you mentioned earlier, the indigenous communities, those were collectives, those were pockets of peace to where people helped people, opposed to looking out for one individual.
Let me ask you a really delicate question, and I recognize that I'm a white woman asking a Black man this question, but how is it? I mean, you're going there in your literature, so I feel comfortable asking you.
Sure.
So we've talked about men and grief. Now I want to talk about Black men and grief, or men who are people of color and grief. Help us understand, if you can, in this short time that we have together, this other layer. It adds a complexity. We've talked here in the past and present series before about Black grief, and I'm wondering from your perspective, what is that additional layer? Let's go there for a second.
Sure, we definitely can go there, and I'm glad you actually want to go there, because when we think of things like grief, the ability to grieve, most people think like, oh man, like just think about it. You have in most family situations, you have a grandmother on your dad's side, grandmother on your mom's side, so when one or two of those people die, you get to grieve and then you get to go on. But from an African American male standpoint, just think about how many killings it was in the news last year, of unarmed African American men getting killed. So the potential to grief, just those two people I mentioned, your two grandmothers on either side, you can learn the process, you can slow back down, because it's probably a distance before the other person passed. But just think about the collection of grief that is seen throughout. So many times you don't have a time to process it. You don't have a time to acknowledge it, because it's another one in the news. It's another one happening in my neighborhood, or it's another, and another misconception is that grief and losses only pertain to death, which is not. You can grieve and have loss of course, a job or family member or relationship, or anything else that's tangible. But when we talk about grief in this setting, we're mostly talking about loss, death per se. So that's another reason why the stigma is so heavy, because African American men, because we view it as, oh man, one, am I next? Or he looked like me and he didn't do anything. Or dang, it just happened last week. How is it another one already? So that ability to recover, and it becomes complex trauma. It becomes so many other variables of one, again, having to figure out like, what am I doing wrong, or what do I need to do to not become a victim? So that's why the specific answer to the African American piece.
You've hit on a couple of things. One is quantity of death
Yeah.
in a Black family is different than the quantity of death experienced perhaps by other communities. You are talking about generational ramifications and the ripple effects. Both of these I got a little bit smarter about when I was reporting an opinion piece that I wrote not too long ago for the New York Times. And we touched on, I say the experts who I interviewed, and you could read that piece. That really floored me. It was new information to me, I'm sure old for you, James, about the quantity. That a Black person in this country will experience death, loss, grief, the ripple effects of that financially, the ripple effects of that if you lose a spouse, the ripple effects of the finances. If you lose a parent, the ripple effects when it comes to continuing your education. So there's more grief, which I guess sounds sad at the most basic level. But then there are true social, political, educational fallout that goes to the massive mental health condition of the African American community. In fact, if I remember this correctly, and maybe Christina, oh, you already put, yes, you already did that. Of course you did. Sorry. If you find that link, a woman who's really smart who is studying this. Her name is Dr. Toni Miles in Georgia, if I'm remembering this correctly. Again, I reported this piece a long time ago for the Times. She was looking at grief as a factor, a determinant of long-term mental health, as similar as smoking, obesity, all those markers that we look at for predicting how long we will live. And she was talking about grief. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, about equating grief in the Black community to being so big and so onerous. It could be on the same scale, according to Dr. Toni Miles, as being too sedentary at your desk or smoking. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah. So I don't disagree. And like I touched on earlier, when I said grief is not just associated with death, because a lot of people think it is, but you yourself highlighted a couple of different factors. That breadwinner in their family that's gone. So now, what is the rest of the family going to do, especially if you don't have the proper life insurances and things like that, and or somebody's in school? So many different factors that are trickled down that will have a direct impact on generational legacy, pretty much, especially within the African American sense, based on different factors of it's already a lack of access and availability to certain things. So if you are the one breaking that cycle and then something sadly happens to you and your affairs are not in order, and or your people don't know that they're in order, that can be another difficult road to navigate. So I think in her comparison, it was more so of lifelong. It's something that we have to process. It's something that we have to be familiar with, because these things can, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, affect and have an impact on generations to come. So I would definitely, agree with that study.
Do you feel that if there's a person or people watching this recording today or in the future, and you are someone who works in a grief center, in a hospice, in a hospital, anywhere where you have contact with grieving individuals and families, that in order to be the most helpful, it's really useful, if not essential, to have workers on your staff who can actually be of color, to speak in a way that feels the most authentic and makes other people feel safe? What is our responsibility of being grief support providers to reflect the diversity of the people who we are serving?
Yeah, so I think that was the key word, diversity. And I definitely think it should definitely have in any setting, not just from a grief standpoint, not just from a hospice or hospital standpoint, but from many other settings too, you definitely should have people who look like the population that they're serving. Not only from a cultural competency standpoint, but somebody from the culture may even know how to connect and how to build that bond and that cohesiveness a little bit more rapidly. That rapport is definitely important, especially if somebody who, because I'm sure you do these things many times and people know that the pretty much 5 stages of grief is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So sometimes people stay in those stages longer than than others, because we each have different resiliency levels. But if you have somebody from the culture, somebody who looks like me, my being in those stages might move along a little bit. I'm able to process more. I'm able to gain different insight better based on you looking like me, our rapport that we've built, the knowledge that you possess based on probably different people that you work with who also look like me, us, and or you've been through it. That depression stage is oftentimes the longest stage. And when somebody looks like you have that familiarity and that comfort level, it's probably easier for you to accept too. So and in many cases, the grief stages don't go in order. So if it is a situation to where I'm comfortable, I'm learning, I'm acquiring different skills and different ways to process my grief from your assistance, then okay, we can hit these stages and I can continue to develop and grow. And it also doesn't mean I have to forget my loved one or I have to not acknowledge the pain of this loss, but you've helped me take more steps, more rapidly than I would have done, just because realistically it's a difference between I'm sure right now if it was an opportunity for a older white person, right, entering the chat, they would probably much rather ask you a question than asking me a question, not even just from a subconscious level, like, oh, let me ask Allison, just from a cultural standpoint, potential age similarity, of course, ethnicity. And then on the other end, it's probably, somebody within who looked like me would be more comfortable asking me than they would ask Dr. Phil, so that's just naturally how it is. People probably open up more if they had more access to people who look like them, especially if you throw in the additional education piece or so many different case studies that we've done. And I've seen it happen just from speaking different places and doing different segments within the community. A lot of people feel like, oh man, like I had this question, but I didn't want to ask it. But now, since you brought it up or since you did the lecture or whatever, I can ask this question. So, which is a good thing.
Well, let me pause just for a second, because you've said a lot.
Sure.
And before we get hit in the chat with some commentary from clinicians who may be in our audience, I do want to address those 5 stages of grief that you talked about. It's often that we talk about those 5 stages for people who are bereaved, but it's important to point out how they were originally constructed. It was for the person who was dying. And so we need to figure out, of course, the language that we can all embrace to talk about when we are sad, when we are depressed. And you had said correctly that, of course, there are no delineations of stages. We go in and out all the time, and grief can be a long journey, not particularly short at all. And so I didn't want the word stages to be left without us kind of discussing that a little bit more. But there's one thing that you said that I really wanted to spend a little bit of time on before we go to our questions,
Okay.
which is this. I think when you put people who are of similar backgrounds together, whether or not it's by gender or by race or what have you, when you feel that comfort level that you were just talking about, it also seems to me it's who is in the room is just as important as who's excluded from the room, making the people who are in that circle more comfortable. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So
Okay.
I'm on the advisory board of TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. This is this is their latest magazine. And they just announced these programs. So I'm just showing it to you. I highlighted some bits I wanted to read to you. And I'm on the advisory board. And TAPS is for grieving military families. And I've seen from the inside, being on the advisory board, how meaningful the work is from the Tragedy Assistance Program for survivors. They have separate programs for people who lost their loved ones to suicide. They have separate programs that are just for women. They have separate programs who are for children who lost parents. So it's not just who's in that group, it's who's excluded from the group that gives people permission to be real when they're in that group, right? So is there a part, for example, when I'm reading about this men's program, just to give me just a second, it says, most men need other men to pave the way for them to grieve. And I wanted to focus on that because going back to what we first talked about, if you feel the need to carry yourself in a certain way in front of your daughter, your mother, your wife, your grandmother, if you're putting on a somewhat of a show to feel that you're presenting yourself as stronger, isn't it also important who's not in the room, not just who is in the room?
Definitely. So I did a group probably not too long ago, a couple months ago, for fathers who've lost and was grieving infant loss, because that's a topic that's rarely talked about amongst men. So it was a group that I introduced because just think about it. If you lost a child, whether it was stillborn or abortion or, you know, any other surrounding that, oftentimes it's a lot of research and access for information available to the mom. You know, she got the OBGYN, she got the doulas, she got the prenatal clinics and everything, giving her resources. But oftentimes that male is like, oh man, what do I do? So that's why I introduced the group. And one of the things that I touched on is the fact that in all of those grieving moments, most men had to be strong in those situations. Think about it. The doorbell ring, somebody come, hey, how you doing? Where is Sue? You know, not acknowledging how you feeling. You just lost your kid as well, but running directly to the mom. So he had to smile and say, oh, she's in the back. She's going, you know, like, when did he have time to address his feelings?
So that's a little bit different though, James, because what you're talking about though is men not receiving services when they could be grieving. And I definitely want to talk about that too,
Sure.
how men are not in that pipeline.
Mhm.
And that's why there have been historically programs that go to barbershops and like make sure that men are getting material. But what I'm talking about is that when men are together and there's no woman or women in that group, you kind of can let your shoulders down. You can kind of
Definitely.
let yourself be vulnerable because you're not fronting to show a woman that you're tough or that you. So that's the point that I'm talking about now.
And in most cases, yes, you can unpack your baggage. One, because again, like going back to that universality piece, oh man, this happened to me too. You can allow yourself to be vulnerable without feeling judged, because the perception is, if I'm in this group for a reason, you're probably in this group for a reason as well. You know, it's not court ordered or you're not mandated to be here. So you're open to being vulnerable and, you know, just feeling.
And let me just push you more. If a woman was there or women were there, what do you think wouldn't happen? If a woman was there, what wouldn't a man do?
It would probably be limited on how they express themselves, you know, just for the simple. I think it can go both ways. Some of them will want to ensure that that lady is getting proper information to take back to the men in her life. But then there'll also be a group of men who is like, I don't really want to say this because, you know, she's viewing me as soft or weak. So those, it can be both perceptions. But hopefully, you know, it would be a space exclusively for men to feel like they can reduce that big burden that they're carrying in most cases.
Well, that helps. I appreciate that. I'm sorry that I pushed back so much on
No,
that.
it's good.
I wanted
Yeah.
to get to that kernel. All right, it is 1:34 as promised. I'm going to hand it over to Christina now, who has been, I am sure, going through that chat with a fine-tooth comb, and she's going to give us some questions from our wonderful group.
Sure. The first one is from Michelle. She wrote, "How can people who identify as female support men in their healing and recovery?"
Is that to me? Yeah, so to be honest with you, first I would tell you, like I tell many different women who encourage their partner or their sons to that come in my therapy door. Um, one, ensure that you're safe. And when I say safe, just make sure you're not putting yourself in a position to be abused, whether that's verbally or emotionally or even physically, because some men view it as nagging when you do want to push them to therapy or healing or just different resources. So I would definitely say make sure that you're safe in those areas, but also just do what you can without adding additional stressors. Just give little reminders or tidbits or even suggest different research. Hey, I found this article, or hey, Dr. Allison is having this speaking function going on, and I think you probably experienced some of these things. Would you mind checking it out? Or I'm gonna check it out. You want to join me? So just be comfortable with being open, but not so much as overbearing, because oftentimes people don't know that they have an issue. They've probably been like this their entire life. So for them, it's their personality, they're stuck in their ways and they're comfortable. It's not until they start impacting other people, which answer this question probably, you're feeling that. So don't drain yourself emotionally. Just put yourself in a position to give research, give little tips, and then don't also be afraid to fall back and pull back if you need to, like reduce it. And hopefully once they see you and or co-workers or other people in the community changing how they interact with them, they take a look at self, because you can do all these things that you want to do, but until they recognize their actions or learn to see that they're impacting other people, they may not change.
Well, I know there's interest in this. So whether or not it's vocalized or not, this has been one of our more powerful in terms of strength, in terms of signups. We had more than 150 people sign up for today's conversation. And I feel like that goes to the importance of this conversation. Many people get tied up with children or work at the last
Yeah.
minute and catch the recording later on. But I know, because I do these every month, that there is great interest in what you are talking about. Before I go to the next question in the chat, and please do listen, James Harris is here from Men to Heal. This is a wonderful opportunity. Please put your questions for him in the chat, or me. I'm happy to answer questions too. But what I wanted to get to is the other resource that you have. You have a journal that I wanted to at least mention to folks, because I think I haven't seen anything like it. Ah, there it is.
Yeah. So it's an interactive journal. It's called Man, Just Express Yourself. And when I say interactive, it's because men have the opportunity to write out their answers or draw out their answers. I designed it that way because oftentimes, again, men don't, in most cases, don't articulate what they're feeling or what they're going through. But of course, they can, do scripts, whether it's song or poetry, or just write it out, and it's a good tool for wives or partners or even parents to get, highlight a couple different chapters, give it to the man or male that's in your life, and you guys process it over dinner and date night. I've seen that be an effective way. And it's over 65 different chapters that I hit on. So it's affirmation, goals, trauma, coaching, mood, displacement, abandonment, grief, trauma, support, resilience. It's so many different stress, peer pressure, social media, insecurities. There's so many different topics that men probably didn't tell you, his wife or mom, but he's open to talking about this in barbershops or the mechanic shop or in a facility of other men, the locker rooms. But of course, you as the mom or parent or sister or, woman authority figure may need this information. So the book is definitely a great tool for you to do that.
There's two things I want to point out about your book, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm a writer, and so I express myself through writing. What I want to acknowledge is the incredible insight that you had in designing your book for those people who find writing an awful experience, who feel stressed and uncomfortable when they can't find the right word, that you give them space to just draw or to sketch something out that you're kind of lowering the blood pressure to be the most inclusive, because writing is not for everybody. Even though I'm a writer, I know that it's hard. And if that stresses you out, then you're not going to get the benefit of what you are trying to offer. So that was my first compliment to you. And my second compliment to you is that your book, unlike from what you've said, and so forgive me if I'm wrong, please correct me, it's also for teens. So it's not just for a grown-up man, it's for adolescents. Is that not right?
Yeah. First, I appreciate your praise for your first point. You being a writer is definitely means a lot to me because I read a couple of your pieces throughout. So yes, but the second point, it's recommended age 10 and up, so 10 to 100. I've had some 8-year-olds do it, of course, with their parent or in after school settings and stuff like that with teachers or administrative. So 10 is ideal to where they can do it themselves and comprehend what they're doing, all the way up to age 100.
I want to go on to a stat that I found to be really important to discuss. And again, if you have questions for James Harris, please put it in the chat. And as soon as I'm done with this question, I do not want to occupy this entire hour. This is your time to make it interactive. I really I'm here to serve this community. And so please make sure if you've joined us, there must have been a reason. There must have been something about the topic that spoke to you. And so please use this time to get James to respond or to have me respond. We are here for you. But here's my stat that I wanted to throw at you, James.
Sure.
Access to mental health services. Clearly, there's a disparity. And according to the Center for American Progress, here is what they say. They say 80%, or sorry, I misspoke already. Sorry, 88% of white Americans have health insurance, whereas 79% of African Americans do. What does that mean when it comes to access to these kind of mental health services that you are saying are so important, particularly to men, and then of course to the Black men that we've been talking about? If there's not as much health insurance, where can they go to get help?
Yeah. So, and those are unfortunate numbers because just think about so many people who didn't contribute to the study or the survey. But there are different resources out there where people can go. It's a resource list on my website, actually, under resources of different charitable organizations who do therapy for free and or at a reduced rate, sliding scale type. So those potentially can assist people. And also just from a standpoint of the access and availability piece will also have a trickle down effect too, because then think about it, if you don't have insurance, that means you probably have to come out of pocket. And if you have to come out of pocket, that means you probably have to substitute your income somewhere else. So that's another reason why, or another part of the stigma to why a lot of people, specifically men, don't go to the doctor and or therapy. And if he's the breadwinner, like, do he really want to take off work to, miss this money and go disclose all his feelings to somebody else? So all of those things can have different adverse effects depending on where you are. So I think that stigma is definitely, that statistic is definitely unfortunate, but I definitely think it's probably higher than that if more people contribute to the survey, or even if they broke it down by gender, probably, because just think about that. Whomever administered it, it probably was a fair study, but it probably also was more women who took the survey, So
I don't know the answer. I should have done that, but I will do my digging because I am nothing but a journalist. I will find out that information for sure. And I wanted to make sure that we talk about a number of different topics, but I want to throw it back to Christina to see if there's any other questions I should get to before I pepper James with my next question. And as a reminder, I am finicky about time. We will be done at the strike of 2 or the strike of 11, depending on where you are. So this is your chance. We will not be going long. If you all of a sudden have a question, with 30 seconds to go, I will say goodbye. So please use this opportunity. I am warning you now. I used to be a TV producer where we lived our lives by the second. So I'm very good at that. So Christina, back to you.
Our next question is anonymous. It says, what can I do as a father to help my son learn how to productively handle and express his emotions?
Oh, that's a good question. So father, one of the most efficient ways that you can do is model. So what I mean by that is, how are you expressing and how are you doing those things that you require of him? Are you displaying those things to where he can see that is normalized? And also, you probably want to introduce him to different men with that same character, whether it's TV shows or whether it's people in the community that you're associated with who are displaying this certain character, to know that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be open. It's okay to be. Without those pressures of being a certain way. So I think that's probably one of the easiest things that you can do, is model that, encourage that, and accept that if your son comes to you and say he'd rather do something that's deemed more feminine than masculine in the eyes of society. So if you do want to cook or do chores or whatever, life skills, don't view it as no, and push back and have him do something else that you probably feel it's more traditional masculine. So, but modeling is definitely one of the best things that you can do.
Hey, I'm a mom and kids are always watching, aren't they?
Yeah.
I appreciate you talking about that. And I also want to ask you a question. You have a program where the acronym is BOIL, and that stands for Better Outcomes in Life Foundation.
Yeah.
BOIL. Can you tell us about BOIL?
Yeah. So BOIL is just like what it sounds like, Better Outcome in Life Foundation. It's a nonprofit that I founded. And to be honest with you, the Healing Hub and Mental Heal was a lot of things that I've done out of my own pocket, as far as helping the community, helping different people with outreach. But one day this big organization said, hey, we have $25,000 we want to give you, but you don't have a nonprofit. So I was like, so for me, it was more so oh man, there's a lot of people who want to pour into me, so I can continue to help people. So let me legalize or get a proper structure. And so that's what it is. So now everything is pretty much more so that people can donate and give their contributions to the work that I'm doing and assistance. So that's how that came about. But everything is still pretty much ran through me as an organization. Of course, I got my board and all those things, decide on what we want to do. But as an entity, it's still pretty much the same primary resources. It's just more so that if somebody's in New York or South Carolina and say, hey, your organization is phenomenal, here's what we have, this pocket of money that we can contribute, or we have these resources that we want to donate, so I can help more people. It's just another way of me doing that.
I love that. And I want to make sure that I capture this opportunity to make sure that people know how to continue the conversation. I'm also a big believer that while we're only here once a month for 1 hour, these conversations don't have to end at precisely the end of the hour. There's many ways of connecting with you, James. On Facebook, you have, I'm going to look down at my notes. That's why I'm not giving you guys eye contact, but it's Men to Heal Mental Health on Facebook. So Men to Heal, the letter TO, Men to Heal Mental Health. That's on Facebook. And then on Instagram, it's Men to Heal, but there's underscores. So it's Men_TO_heal, Men to Heal on Instagram. Of course, none of this would be possible without For Grief. And so I want to say, we've been talking about community being so important, and For Grief has a Facebook page and an Instagram, but also For Grief has a community resource where people can come together as a page. It's private. You have to just, request to be entered. You'll come in, but it's a safe place for you to divulge your sadness, a place for you to express. Maybe it's ugly. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's even uglier than that. Maybe it's resentment. So I feel that by taking advantage of people who may be in a similar spot as you are right now, if you can find that sense of connection, whether it's through a Facebook community or an in-person opportunity that James offers, take advantage of it. I know from personal experience, both my parents died pretty young. I had lost both of them by the time I was a young adult, by the time I was 31. Neither of my children remember their maternal grandparents. My mother died before I was married, so she didn't get to meet her grandchildren. And my father died when my oldest was just a toddler. And so the reason why I bring this up is that there's a need to give voice to this kind of pain. It impacted the way I raise my children, having gone through that kind of loss. That's largely invisible to anyone unless I vocalize it. The way it changed how I mother my children. You wouldn't think there's a connection, but there is. It also changed the relationship I have with my spouse, with my husband. The dynamic shifted when my parents died and his parents were alive. The balance of power between traditions and what foods get served at the holiday. What traditions do you follow in November or December when that time of year comes around? Which family has the most sway over your kids? Again, these are invisible, but really very concrete consequences of grief. And they can only come up, James, don't you think, when you're talking about them?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the misconceptions too. Oftentimes people feel like if we talk about it, we're going to continue to, um, be sad or whatever. But no, that's a part of process, and that's a part of moving on. It's okay to relive those memories of that loved one or that situation. So all of that, it also can help another family member too. So grieving itself is definitely a fundamental process of growth. So don't feel like you have to be trapped and not have a certain emotion surrounding it, whether it's joy and or pain, and don't feel like the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. No, it's okay to process it. And don't get caught up in, if I don't cry, that don't mean I'm not sad about the loss, which is also not true, because people, again, have different resiliency levels and we process different things differently. So it's no time limit on grief. It's no 6 months I'm done grieving, or it's no 10 years I'm done grieving, because at any time, it can hit you. So just continue to process and live that journey. It's not linear. It's a couple of different ripples in there. It's some highs and lows, and some joys, and it's sometimes you may get upset. So don't feel like that you have to be a certain way in order to grieve.
Hey, listen, you know that better than anyone else. You tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but you lost your first parent when you were 5. And
Yeah.
then your mother got very, very sick, your father at 5. And then your mother got sick much later on. When you were 8, I believe, you went into the foster care system. This has had ripple effects throughout your entire life. Clearly, you founded Men to Heal in large measure on the support that you did not receive. If I'm remembering that correctly, James, is that not right?
Yeah, no, you got a good memory. That's definitely correct. Yep. At the age of 5, I lost my father to cancer. Age 8 or 9, mom got sick with epilepsy, and she was having strokes. And she's actually doing well now. She has epilepsy still, but she hasn't had a stroke in maybe 2 or 3 years. So we're fortunate for that. So
But you were put in the foster care system. I'm so glad to know that she is okay. That just made my day, because the literature that I read is that you went into foster care. You did not receive the support that you needed. It wasn't grounded in a Black male experience. That's
sure.
what I've read. And so it led me to believe that she did not survive. What a relief. But still, the support is not what you needed at that time in foster care, which just goes to the seed, the origin story of Men to Heal.
Sure. Yep. So the foster care system and then group home system was just that. It was systematic. It was I felt like it was a check in the box, you know, and not a authentic process to allow children within the system to have positive access and availability to things. You know, as a child being in the system, it was a mandatory weekly therapy session. But of course, I'm this young kid from the projects, and all the therapists were older white people, you know, so it wasn't a connection. Again, I felt like it was a check in the box. So that's a part of the reason why I am here now, why I started that journey, so I can connect with so many different people on so many different levels, being that I have experienced life on so many different levels. So I work with Department of Social Services now to ensure that they are, you know, having a certain level of intent when it comes to people within the system, whether foster care or group home. I emancipated myself at 16 because back in these times it was age out at 18. So I just, you know, figure I can get a head start and do what I have to do. But now it's in different states, it's multiple independent living steps. So if you age out, they have an opportunity for you to go to independent living and stay until you're 24, or if you're still in college, you know. So those are some of the initiatives that I was able to assist with, and it's making an impact. And of course, just being a veteran, you know, 8 years, 2 deployments, 1 Iraq, 1 Afghanistan, I ensure that now I give back to my veterans as well. You know, so I'm just fortunate to be young, 36, but have lived many different lifestyles, and that's pretty much my impact to hit those pockets that I didn't have and didn't observe or didn't have access to when I was younger. So I'm fortunate.
Well, I am grateful. Christina, one last lightning round question, if there's one that we can get to before we leave. And then I have a funny thing to mention to James right before we go. But is there one more question?
Yes. Ada asks, what's your recommendation on how to start a grief support group?
So depending on where you are geographically, I would definitely suggest you create that buzz where you are, within your neighborhood or your community, your churches, high schools, and or use social media. That's a big platform. So gain the interest of people, and you'll be surprised of how many other people are probably looking for the group or want to start a group and didn't know which areas to take. So I would definitely challenge you as well as encourage you to create that buzz. Just put up a post or do a poll, and then take it from social media and put it in your neighborhood. There's probably a community center around that you probably can use, and or if you feel comfortable, start it in your house or meet at a library, you know, get a conference room or something, and just see what the interest is, and keep it small up until you're able to grow, up until you're able to get that foundation going.
I would add, do not do it alone. I amplify what James says. It's too much work, and you want that buy-in, and you want to shape it from the beginning to reflect the needs of that group. So if you get people to help you shape something, they're going to be more invested in that something. So that's number one. And number two, I would decide whether it's peer-to-peer or whether or not you're going to bring in an actual practitioner to lead, because those are very two different kinds of support groups. The funny thing I wanted to mention to James, and I have 2 minutes left to do it, is that I've been so, for years now, 11 years, writing this new book that's coming out in September. And Elsie Robinson is the subject of the biography that I'm writing. And she was a writer back in the 20s and 50s. And in the 1930s, she worked in a gold mine, the only woman amongst a sea of men. And here's what she said about that experience. I had crossed the wall, left woman's world behind me. Now I was with men, always with men, and only men. I heard no other voices, knew no other problems. 1934, they were separating the fact that a man's perspective, of course, was different from what she was feeling as a woman in a man's world. So you are in good company, my friend. This has been something that we have been wrestling with for quite some time, but you have put a name to it, Men to Heal. You have done so in such extraordinary ways, and I feel so blessed and so privileged that I got to share what you are doing with the Reimagine and For Grief communities. And thank you, James.
No, again, I appreciate you for having me the first time, but to come back and do it again, I definitely I'm humbled. I definitely enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I was able to share the information that I have, and I'm glad that you viewed me as somebody who you're willing to get the information from. So again, I appreciate you, your platform, and everybody else. So definitely thank you.
As promised, it's the strike of 2 or the strike of 11, depending on where you are. Thank you guys so much for being with us. We will be back again, of course, in August. And it's my favorite time of the month. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everybody.